Hello and welcome back from the break. My name is Stephanie Holm. I'm the co-director of the Western States Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit at UCSF, and I'm also a public health medical officer with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment at California EPA, and I'll be moderating this session for us. So as Jill mentioned before the break, we're moving into the conversations about the specific components of the supply chain. And so we'll be starting with the design phase in this session. We're going to be examining standards during the design and manufacturing portion of the supply chain. So the Healthcare and Public Health Sector Joint Supply Chain Resiliency Working Group's Product Standardization Task Force, long name, that you heard about earlier, identified several standard gaps that really affect the design of PPE and PPT. So while there's more than we can go over in the short time here, I'll just highlight a few of those identified gaps, really to illustrate the complexity of the issue. So for respirators, for example, as many of us know, there are no requirements to assess outward leakage or source control. And so, requirements for this type of assessment could impact how respirators are designed. Near and dear to my heart, among the general public, there is no guidance, no standards for respirator use, including among pediatric users. And so that has notable implications on design. For eye and face protection devices, there are gaps around protection from aerosols, guidance for addressing fogging, among other things, which again have implications for design. We also have people, often workers, who use multiple types of PPE at the same time, right? You've got goggles and a respirator and a gown and gloves. And so in the design phase, we really need standards to take into account that these ensembles are being used, as well as the interoperability of the equipment and the functionality. So I'm really looking forward to getting into all of these issues more deeply with this discussion. We have a great lineup of speakers with a really wide range of experiences. As we've done with prior sessions, I'll invite each speaker to share a short set of remarks for about 5 minutes each, and then we'll have hopefully a robust discussion afterwards. If you'd like more info on our panelists, a link to their bios is on the event webpage. As before, if you have a question to ask the panel, please feel free to put that in the Q&A window beneath the video player, and our staff will get those to us. All right, our first speaker in this session is Joe Warple, who is a senior design engineer at Milwaukee Tool. Joe, take it away.
Thanks, Stephanie. Like Stephanie said, my name is Joe Warple. I'm a senior design engineer at Milwaukee Tool, with my focus being on providing innovative solutions for PPE products. I'm not sure if anybody is familiar with Milwaukee Tool on this panel, but we don't just make power tools anymore. We have an entire team of 25 engineers working full-time on designing nothing but PPE for the job site. Our core trades users are mechanical, electrical, plumbers, general contractors, residential construction, and power utility are the kind of main areas of focus we design product for. And all of these individuals were essential workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. So their work never stopped, nor did ours. We launched more PPE products during COVID than any other time in our company's history for PPE. I'm going to speak a little bit on how standards are influencing design of product and how there is flexibility or lack thereof in some standards, allowing for innovation, as well as how we can potentially kind of smooth things out globally and look at global harmonization of standards in the PPE space and how that may affect not only supply chain, but ability to get PPE available to other people around the country and around the world. So looking at individual standards and their ability for us to innovate within them, I want to call attention to design requirements versus performance requirements in a lot of these standards. For example, looking at rubber insulated gloves for power utility workers. If you read through that standard, which is ASTM D120, they fully define what the glove looks like, composition, exact material selection from a Dow chemical, exact mechanical properties of material and material thickness throughout the glove. When you get standards like that that define exactly how to design a product, it makes it very hard for manufacturers and product designers to innovate in that space. We have a lot of user feedback and user research on power utility workers. And they have these big Michelin man marshmallow fingers trying to do very intricate, delicate work. And we think there's an opportunity to provide innovation there with making their gloves more dexterous, more breathable. But the current standards do not allow for that, which makes it very hard for us to please our end users and ultimately make them safer on the job site. One way to get around this is to make more robust performance requirements and performance targets rather than design requirements that dictate design, verbatim to the standard. And this isn't just present in power utility standards. This goes everything from head protection, high visibility clothing, hand protection, and many others in this PPE space for these kind of construction trades users. The last topic I want to talk about briefly is the global harmonization of PPE standards and how we can really expedite time to market for a lot of different products and eliminate some confusion on the job site and with end user groups on, what product is safer or what product is meeting my needs on my job site in particular. So looking across the world, job sites are relatively the same, building the same types of buildings, using the same types of tools, and the same hazards exist if that's a drop hazard, if that's a viral hazard like COVID-19, or heat hazards, for example. But if you look at standards across the globe and looking at industrial head protection as kind of a key example here, you have 4 different standards that cover United States, Canada, Europe, and Australia, New Zealand, all with different requirements for their products. And that's just not design requirements, also performance requirements as well. You might ask yourself, but they're doing the same work with the same job site risks and hazards, so why do we have different sets of standards available to different parts of the world? And that's kind of a question we've been asking a lot internally as well as we branch out into providing PPE for Canada and providing PPE for Europe and the UK. If there was a globalized, harmonized set of standards out there, it really reduces confusion on our end user side of things. They can have a clear comparison of technologies and clear comparison of products across their product line to truly make the best decision for them, for their application. It also makes it much easier for manufacturers to design product quicker and faster and come to market faster with more confidence of getting PPE out to the people who need it most, because there is that kind of unified front in what is required of those products. Typically with how we design product at Milwaukee Tool, we can take anywhere from 6 to 18 months to fully design a product. When you look at head protection, that's one head protection product or project for a US helmet, one project for a Canadian helmet, one project for a European helmet. A company of our size with 25 engineers, we can handle that and we can dedicate resources to that. But some smaller companies, startup companies, it kind of prohibits them from getting into these new countries and new spaces that do need innovative solutions for the different PPE products, which I think really limits how much we can really influence that and get very high performing product and even competition in designing a high performing product out there across the globe. And I think harmonizing some of these global standards or harmonizing 2 global standards would go a long way in kind of leveling that playing field and getting PPE out to the ones that need it most.
Thank you so much, Joe. Really appreciate the discussion of the flexibility and that global perspective as well. Our next speaker is Jennifer Schneider from the Rochester Institute of Technology. Thanks, Jennifer.
So I had my first technology challenge and I had 3 words in. I really appreciate being invited, and I have had a great time listening to the speakers today. I've spent my career applying, teaching, developing, and creating curricula related to standards in environmental health and safety. But in my comments today, I'm going to spend my time talking about the non-standard among us. You can't tell from this Zoom, but I am just under 5 feet tall. Depends on whether I have a fluffy hair day, with a physical disability. And even as a 30-year CIH with a doctorate, I have struggled to find PPE that worked for me and have become adept at the workaround, especially in my time volunteering on the hazmat team before my disability became too much. Yes, small female, disabled people can successfully lead hazmat teams. For my purposes here, I will focus on the disabled, though much of what I say certainly applies to many, many more, because humans come in all shapes, sizes, and abilities. Consider this. The U.S. Census Bureau says that the U.S. has 26.5 million non-elderly disabled people. The Rochester Institute of Technology, where I lead something called the Collaboratory for Resiliency and Recovery, is something of a mecca for the different. RIT is the home of the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, which is integrated within a larger technical university of hearing people. Due to that, we've really evolved into a community of very smart people that are open to difference. But when the pandemic hit, we needed respiratory protection for thousands, for abled, for disabled of many types, and for the hearing impaired. Unfortunately, most of the options for clear masking do not live up to their hype. Importantly, too, clear masks or respiratory protection is not just for the DHH or DHH plus, deaf and hard of hearing, or plus other abilities, but for those around them to participate in society. Seeing faces is critically important. As you know, it's not just the 12 million hearing impaired, but many with communication challenges and processing challenges that need faces. And it sure helps the rest of us too. We didn't know how much we relied on those faces until we could not see them. So in response, RIT created a broad clear mask project with engineers, physicists, industrial designers, textile experts, material scientists, interpreters, the DHH, of course, and more, where we are evaluating the product marketplace and working to design and solve haze, fog, seal, wet, interference with hearing aid, cochlear implant, vibration, and even glasses. Most of the products we tested have not stood up to normal use and provided visibility. We needed capability for filtration, ease, dexterity, and adjustability. We also need to consider how to manage ADA and disabled education plans while providing safety for the disabled and those around them. Importantly, we also need appropriate testing protocols. And as with any tool, we have to think about implications for health and safety for see, slip, trip, grip, and snag. Accessibility is governed by usability, considering the capacity of the user, the relationship to the hazard, because different users experience hazards differently, and additional constraints such as other conditions, fit needs, and interference with aids. Accessibility is not providing equity in case someone shows, but rather expecting all types of persons to be present and participate. More importantly, we know that these inclusive actions benefit more than just the directly disabled. They make it better for us all. My recommendations, broadly, orient standards as performance-based where possible. This allows makers and users flexibility. Pull as much feedback as you can, as possible, from the users. Increasingly, our human race is more non-standard. Finally, nothing beats field experience. So fund the creator. For truly inclusive PPE, we need centers that can create and guide the production of that PPE for special user communities, especially for applications not easily commercialized, and use that to guide standards for broader use. We didn't come at this in a vacuum. Because of what RIT is, we already print and create superhero hand prosthetics for children in international communities, run a studio for students to apply their engineering and design skills for accessibility tools, have a functional deaf health lab, advanced technology for human-centered computing, and so much more. Unfortunately, what we've experienced is that most MDs do not know the details of PPE, and what's more, they don't know how to find us or anybody else for help. Supporting and expanding this capacity would make a measurable difference and impact beyond single individuals. I truly applaud this critical work by the National Academy and CDC NIOSH. I sort of feel like I've come to a family reunion. I would like to thank you for inviting me to speak.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, then next up in our family reunion is Susan Sokolowski from the University of Oregon.
Good morning. Thank you again for inviting me to this session. I'm a product designer, and my research lies at the intersection of the human body and product shape, sizing, and fit. And I do this work through the study of anthropometry, which is the systematic measurement of the human body, And anthropometry was used early as a tool by physical anthropologists and is now used across academic fields for the purposes of understanding anatomical variation, size, and shape. What's unique about my work is to gather those measurements, I use what is called 3D scanning technologies, such as laser, structured light, infrared depth sensors, photogrammetry, to capture human form as a point cloud to collect anthropometric data to develop blueprints for product development. Specifically, my work focuses on equitable PPE solutions for women and minorities. And today I'm going to share with you 3 examples of how my work is addressing gaps related to PPE design to help influence future standards. If we go to the next slide, the first example is around N95 mask fit. And as we all know on this call today, it is well known that fit pass rates differ between men and women. And also Caucasian male and female average have higher fit pass rates than Asian male and female average at 90% and 84% respectively. When Asian data is narrowed down to just female subjects, a much lower fit pass rate was reported of 60%. And other researchers like Wilkinson et al. In 2020 found the same similar findings that Caucasian subjects had higher fit pass rates compared to Asian subjects, excluding South and Central Asian subjects of 90% versus 83%. So in my work, much like many of the other speakers, I'm interested in, what the design pipeline is for building PPE. And so in this body of work, we were building a design pipeline using digital tools. And we found 3 major challenges that prohibit designers and developers from creating equitable N95 masks. And the first one that you see here was that the majority of the big scanning databases that were used for our studies revealed that scans of people of color were incomplete. And you can see here that when we say incomplete, it means that the scanner cannot capture like people of color. And you can see kind of these scan gaps in the picture here. And this makes it really challenging to collect accurate measurements. We see similar results also in foot data, therefore calling out the need for scanning companies to validate their technologies for all skin colors. Secondly, we found that scanning databases often collect head scans with folks wearing skull caps that cover the ears. And knowing that the ears are a major anchoring point to the design and fit of a mask, better care needs to be taken by data collectors to capture better scan data. And lastly, in our work that you're seeing on the slide here, we found that making watertight 3D forms to fill these scan holes, we needed to fill them with kind of these softwares that allow these watertight models. We found that the softwares that we trialed covered the scans and they turned people of color into Caucasian faces, which is very alarming to see. And you can see this in the bottom of the slide here. And so the call out here is that better care needs to be made with these conversion platforms. If we go to the next slide, the next example that I wanted to share is in glove design. And this slide shows a study where we surveyed over 700 subjects at the Minnesota State Fair around glove fit. This image on the top shows female and male perceptions. The darker the circle, the more severe the fit issue reported on gloves. And these were gloves for work, sport, and for outdoor environment in the cold weather. This work has inspired us to develop a new set of anthropometric measures for glove design, totaling 22 measures as opposed to the 5 measures you see on the bottom here. These 5 measures are the typical hand measures that most anthropometric studies have for PPE development. And then lastly, on the next slide, I'd like to share with you some work that we've done related to coat, pant, glove, and boot sizing and fit challenges as described by female firefighters. From this work, we identified challenges again because fire PPE is not sized and fitted with enough body measures. Notice in this diagram how the issues called out include problems with the circumferences and lengths of the body. The table below highlights kind of what the NFPA requires for sizing and fit measures. They only call out 4 measures when sizing and fitting PPE. And I want you to note here how these measures are mostly circumferential, and they don't include hip and major length measures between the chest and waist to hip. And for women and minorities, these are especially where the problems align in fit and sizing issues. And so again, there's an opportunity to improve these set of standards to improve fit and safety. And from that, I'll hand it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Really appreciate that, including the visuals. Really, really helpful. All right, our next speaker is Victoria Jacqua from Open Source Medical Supplies. Go ahead, Victoria.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the Academy for hosting me, and I'm really enjoying this workshop. And I'm really glad to hear so many viewpoints, both just in PP in general and historical COVID perspectives that align perfectly with OSMS's grassroots experience. So a lot of people don't know what OSMS is. We are a grassroots advocacy group that started in March of 2020, specifically to encourage the creation and manufacturing of open source designs to get PPE into the hospitals first. That was our first push. And that eventually trickled down into public PPE. So there's an enormous world of additive manufacturing that also goes over to distributed manufacturers, retooled manufacturers that responded during the pandemic. And we saw kind of this open door for a few months between public creators of PPE bringing designs at scale to their hospitals. And we saw that the highest quality performance standards within hospitals were also attractive to the public at large. So I think when we're talking about standards for public PPE, we need to remember that healthcare workers are also members of the public. And if families are used to their family member who's a healthcare worker being protected by a certain standard, and then that person is outside the hospital, there's a tendency to expect the public standard, even if it's only across a few people's perception, to be the same. So we found that the public wanted the highest level of protection, that whatever the doctor and nurse needed in the hospital to also be applicable to their home situation. This is especially true when you had people under quarantine and parents taking care of sick children. The same particle protection rate was desired in the home as would be required in the hospital. So this resulted in a massive iteration of designs that are still open source and contained in the OSMS project library that were iterated with hospitals, university, medical systems, and reached some pretty high levels of certification. The Prusa face shield was validated by the Czech Ministry of Health, and that resulted in a massive movement towards face shields in the United States. I think about the end of March that happened. So what resulted here was individual hospitals would often receive designs and they would test them through their clinical staff or their infectious disease department. University medical systems would also iterate designs, whether they were respirators, surgical level masks. Ear savers were a new innovation. No standards exist for ear savers, but we had this amazing new product category result to help masks fit better and increase mask comfort. So we had this vast amount of information going back and forth from clinical staff into the public, and a large number of designs developed. Where we are now is because of the regulatory pathway for manufacturers of medical devices, the manufacturer receives the regulation and the standards validation. Whereas if there was more focus on validating open source designs and encouraging the innovation that occurs through that pathway, it's possible that tech packs for open source designs could be developed, standards for a surgical mask, a respirator, a gown, a ear saver could be created that would be accessible to the public. So in creating resiliency, if people wanted to have access to that design, make it for themselves, for their own individual use, they could know that that design, if made by a certain steps following certain standards, would be safe to use, and also would allow niche communities that have trouble receiving product in a timely manner, whether it's a supply chain gap or accessibility, they could have access to a design that they know is safe to use and that would save a lot of steps in the manufacturing process. So things could be made faster and get to the communities where they're needed. And I'm at time.
Great. Thank you so much, Victoria. Our next speaker is Jessica Tredenik, who works on global standards development in 3M's, or with global standards in 3M's personal safety division.
Thanks, Stephanie. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this important discussion. There's so much to be said on all of these topics. As you said, I'm Jessica Tredenik. I am 3M Personal Safety Division's Global Standards Development Manager, and I'm excited to comment today on standards impacting the design of respiratory protection and the impact of those standards on supply chain resiliency. I wanted to first make the point that when it comes to standards impacting PPE, and in particular respiratory protection, there's a lot that is already solved. And I want to encourage all of us to not over-engineer a standardization solution, because it might end up actually exacerbating some of the supply chain challenges that we've all been talking about here today. First, it's 3M's view that the existing standards that respirators must meet as part of NIOSH's approval program are optimally flexible to help ensure that respirators are able to deliver the protective performance needed. Those standards specify the performance criteria needed to confirm respirator effectiveness without dictating how that effectiveness should be accomplished via respirator design. This performance standards approach that's currently employed by NIOSH allows manufacturers to address the diversity of the US population in terms of size, comfort, and also design for particular applications. Creating and applying unnecessary standards, and in particular overly prescriptive design standards, would stifle innovation and also possibly reduce the quality of products that are available by also stifling competition. And I know that that's the opposite of what we're trying to achieve here. Furthermore, creating overly specialized PPE designs and design standards for specific applications will reduce manufacturers' ability to scale up quickly by flex purposing production capacity of high volume general industry PPE, which, as you heard from Nikki McCullough earlier, was one of the ways in which manufacturers like 3M was able to help ease the emergency driven PPE demand spikes, both during COVID-19 and during earlier infectious disease outbreaks. So we are starting from a position of strength. There's a lot that's already solved, but I also want to comment on some gaps in respiratory protection standards in the US that should be addressed, both to help improve supply chain robustness for healthcare, but also to position us here in the US for success in developing a regulatory framework that also addresses public health respiratory protection. First, with respect to the design of filtering face piece respirators, including N95s, there should be a fit performance requirement adopted and implemented by NIOSH that addresses filtering face piece respirators. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many healthcare customers have reported, especially earlier during the demand spike, that they were receiving N95s from the Strategic National Stockpile that did not fit enough of their workforce to be useful for them as PPE. NIOSH has published in their 2023 regulatory agenda their intention to propose a rule on respirator fit capability that would apply to FFRs, and we absolutely support this action. Second, The second gap that I want to highlight, which has also been touched on by many other speakers, is that there's a need for regulatory framework for public health respirators. Dan Shipp pointed out first earlier this morning that PPE that is used in workplaces can also be effective against hazards that are often encountered by members of the public. So a biological particle, wildfire smoke particles, and PM 2.5 are all captured effectively by the filtered media in N95 respirators. Thinking specifically about the design of public health PPE, I think it's often not known to audiences here in the US that 3M has actually designed, manufactured, and sold respirators for children in other countries, where the scope of the respirator approval programs is broader and supports approval of products for non-worker populations, including children. And in these frameworks that exist in other countries, the manufacturer specifies the face size range that the product is designed for, and then demonstrates via testing to a performance standard that the respirator design adequately fits those faces. 3M has received the difficult question from members of the public here in the US. Why do you not sell your child respirators in the US? What is needed here in the US is an extension of our current very effective NIOSH respirator approval program to include public health respirators. N95 respirators can and do work for members of the public. And the more similar public health and healthcare respirators are to N95s, the more adaptable and robust the supply chain will be. However, to inform which small adjustments might be needed for public health respirator designs, there is a need for public health guidance on when and where to use the respirators, and there is a need for a better collective understanding among all of us in the broader community of what level of inhalation protection is needed for members of the public. And the reason this is needed is because the design process for any respirator involves navigation of the balance of many design considerations, including the sealing ability of the design and also the comfort of the design. For workplace applications, the selection framework set by OSHA sets clear expectations for the quality of the fit that is needed. Respirator designs balance that market expectation for sealing performance with end user expectations for comfort. That's true in any occupational population. It's also true in public health populations. A respirator fit performance standard that's appropriately flexible could be applied to specify a fit performance requirement for specific portions of the US population, such as adult or child members of the public. This specification would enable manufacturers to innovate designs that optimally balance effective sealing or protection capability with the comfort and other accommodations that are desired. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Jessica. All right, and our last speaker before we do our discussion is Nicholas Smith, formerly with American Mask Manufacturers Association. Nicholas.
Everyone, thank you for joining us here today. So I'm going to briefly talk about the importance of masks, how they work, and for example, with source control, as well as problems that have prevented people from being able to find proper masks for their situation. I started the pandemic by helping people understand the importance of masking, how they work for infection control, and overlooked communication failures leading to awareness gaps, as well as the less effective pandemic planning and the accidental spread of misinformation. Now, when it comes to masks, it's important to know that for one person, what's right for them might not be right for another individual. So it's important to understand your situation, your environment, the risk you're facing, and what might be best for your situation. For example, if somebody is hard of hearing and needs to read lips, they might need somebody to be wearing a respirator that has a clear panel in front so they could be able to read lips. Now, there are 4 main types of masks, or 5 main types of masks you may be aware of. There's cloth masks, which are the least effective for both droplet and airborne transmission. And they're also the least effective for source control. And the reason that is because they don't have the technology in surgical masks or N95s or filters from elastomeric respirators that help attract and trap the filter particles. So the virus particles can get through the gaps, but they can also get through the mask material itself. And when it comes to surgical masks, they are very great at droplet protection, but unless you pair it with what's called a mask brace, which helps seal it to your face, then they're less effective for airborne transmission, and they're also less effective for source control. But when you pair it with the mask brace, which is a 15-cent piece of rubber, you can buy it from online or you can make it yourself at home. It helps seal it so that it becomes almost as effective as an N95. And then we come to KN95s. The reason they are slightly less effective than N95s is because they have an ear loop design. So they don't always fit as tightly to the face as the N95. And they don't also go through the strict approval process that N95s do. Now, the reason N95s are so great is because not only do they have a material that helps attract and trap the virus particles as well as other dangerous particles, but they also seal tightly to the face. So they don't have a gap that allows the virus to get through to infect the wearer. And they're also great for source control because the air still goes through the mask on the way out. And lastly, one of the major types of masks that have been overlooked by a lot of people are called elastomeric respirators. You might be familiar with these in industrial settings. They tend to have filters on the side. Sometimes you see them often in TV shows and movies. And that is what was originally supposed to be put into widespread use during pandemics. Before the pandemic occurred, after H1N1, the CDC worked along with the FDA and other agencies to determine what would be effective at preventing N95 shortages for pandemics, and they decided to put elastomeric respirators into widespread use. Now, elastomeric respirators have exhalation valves, so they could potentially let unfiltered air out, but there are overlooked CDC studies that explain that compared to surgical masks for source control, so protecting the wearer, even uncovered exhalation valves protect the wearer, or those around the wearer, better than the loose-fitting surgical masks would. So it's important to know, as well as masks that protect against airborne transmission also protect against droplet transmission. For example, N95s and elastomeric respirators also provide great protection for droplet transmission. So if you're facing a danger that's unknown, for example, like we did with COVID, we weren't sure if it was droplet or airborne, using the higher levels of protection for airborne transmission would have gave the public and workers better protection for COVID from the beginning. A big problem that occurred is people have trouble finding reliable masks. And a big problem with that is because there was online censorship at the start of the pandemic. And the reason there was censorship is because healthcare workers did not have the masks they needed to stay safe. So it created supply chain shortages. So the way we dealt with those shortages is the government worked with Google, Facebook, Amazon, and others to ensure that manufacturers and others could not advertise masks online that could take away from the supply of healthcare workers. Unfortunately, when the N95 shortage was declared over in April 2021, there was no communication between the government and these agencies or social media sites such as Google. So the restrictions stayed in place. And for a lot of manufacturers, they're still there. So if you're trying to find a reliable mask, it may be hard to find. So you might have to do a lot more research to find what is right for you. For example, as well as communication failures is when it comes to things like reusable PPE versus disposable PPE. Reusable PPE, such as elastomeric respirators, they typically last years with an annual filter change, but they also seal better to the face. So healthcare workers, for example, or those performing quick head movements, they could lose the seal. And when it came to N95 use versus elastomeric respirators, for example, healthcare workers lost the seal 28% of the time while performing occupational head movements such as CPR, while elastomeric respirator users never lost the seal. So it also has greater protection when it comes to people that might be more active, such as frontline workers, or if you're going into an environment where you might be running or doing physical activity, things like reusable PPE might be more important for you as well. And some of the awareness gaps around elastomeric respirators since the start of the pandemic meant a lot of people, including healthcare workers, were not using the right type of PPE for their situation. For example, before having to reuse an N95 or reuse expired N95, workers were supposed to be provided with elastomeric respirators, but because of the awareness gap to their importance, this was not done. So please remember to look what's right for you. And if you're not sure, talk to an expert or talk to somebody within your workplace health and safety department, and they can help you find what's right for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. And huge thank you to our entire panel. It's been really, really great to hear all of your thoughts. I think one common thread that I've heard through many of the talks, both in this panel and actually in others, is the importance of performance-based standards. That, rather than specifying exact construction or materials used for PPE, that performance-based standards allow things to be much more nimble and flexible and innovative, and that can, help with getting PPE and PPT to the end users. All right, we have some questions in our chat from the audience. So question one, which I'm going to send to you in a minute, Jennifer, is should a national pediatric medical group write the standards for pediatric respirators? And part of why I'm sending this to Jennifer is that she mentioned that MDs don't have a lot of knowledge. And as a pediatrician myself, I will say that the amount of time that was spent on respirators or respiratory protection in my medical training, both of the residencies that I completed, was exactly 0 minutes, 0 seconds. So, I've gotten involved in this world in the last few years, and I'm happy to do so. But I will own the fact that MDs have very little knowledge. And punt over to you, Jennifer.
I agree with you, Stephanie. It's interesting because in addition to all of the technical stuff that I do, I also happen to be a regional school board member. And, I've joked about my size, but part of what I do as a school board member is spend a lot of time in our primary elementary school. And I think that they send me there because I fit in the chairs. So I think that pediatricians should be part of this because they understand the constituency better than, say, a certified industrial hygienist. But I really think it needs to be a partnership. So, my certification says industrial hygienist, but I have a lot of experience that could be applied in that sphere. And the pediatrician has a lot of experience that could be shared with me. And I think that that's a common theme that we hear across this entire conversation that we're having is that we've really got to collaborate on these things. I've been amazed at how open NDs have been when I've worked with them, but it takes a lot for them to even find the time to find people that are interested in this, right? And I think that there's an awful lot on all NDs' plates. And so this is not something that would be at top of mind for them probably too.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, certainly that point about the centralness of collaboration certainly carries through everything we're all talking about today and tomorrow. All right, our second question is specifically directed at you, Susan, which is the data that you presented publicly available? Where can where can folks find fit statistics for face masks for white versus Asian people and for other racial and ethnic groups?
Yeah, so this is a major problem with the anthropometric databases that are available. So the databases that I referred to in my conversation include the CSER database, which was collected. It was one of the first comprehensive databases collected in 2002. And unfortunately, that database had very poor representation of people of color, very low numbers. So that is not a good reference. The other widely referenced database, anthropometric database, is from US Army NADIC, and there's a 1988 study and also a 2012 answer study. Those are more comprehensive, but they're also of military personnel. So the age range and the body type is very different than common users. And so often that is not helpful in the work we do in PPE. And then there's other databases. There's an ISO standard, and there's also other smaller databases. But some of the work that we're trying to do, my partner, for example, Lindsay Griffin at University of Minnesota, one of their goals is to actually collect face scans. And they've been doing that. They started a scan database over the summer at the University of Minnesota. They've also been collecting children's face scans, which is children's anthropometric data is sorely missed in this field. And a lot of reasons why children's data is missing is because of, under 18 and human subjects and the capturing of the face is often really hard to do under university IRB, protecting children. The other database is also Size North America. That is a 2017 database, a little bit more diverse, but when you're looking at faces, sometimes that data is not as clean. So it's very problematic right now, and there's a lot of work to be done in this space.
Thank you so much, Susan. I have a question for you guys based off of something Victoria brought up, which is, the idea that healthcare workers and other workers are also members of the public. And, certainly it was illustrated pretty clearly during the COVID-19 pandemic that there's a lot of confusion between, different settings and what kinds of personal protective equipment are useful in different settings. Maybe I'll start with Victoria, and then I'd love to hear from our other panelists as well on, how do you think standards can really help with design strategies that will decrease that confusion?
So I'll address that. And I also see I've been prompted to answer another question. How did open source medical supplies do its testing? First, to be very clear, OSMS is not a company or a manufacturer. We do not create open source designs ourselves. We are a library, a curation of open source designs that were developed externally by university systems, physicians, engineers, air chemists. We have I think over 40 supply categories featuring over 200 designs, the majority of which were created real time in the first few months of the pandemic. We have curated those into a library because we saw that there was enormous value in preserving this information. Those designs were tested by each individual organization. We have designs from University of Wisconsin, University of Washington, MIT, Rutgers, all sorts of locations. In terms of getting back to the first part of your question, I think we need to come across this really simply. The best PPE is PPE that is worn. And the PPE that is worn repeatedly over a long period of time is going to be PPE that allows the person to feel like they are not wearing it. It is comfortable. It is easy to put on. It is affordable, meaning I bought something that's $1,000 and I have to be really careful that I don't drop it because it's expensive to replace. Something that is accessible. If someone has a cochlear implant, if they have anything that affects straps that are uncomfortable on the head, that's something to consider. So how can we create performance standards that are going to offer the highest level of protection, whether you're in a wildfire or in an aerosol generating environment, but also make it so it is going to be worn for the lengths of time it's required to be worn. Children do not like to wear masks. They don't like to wear things on their face. So I'm going to point towards Flow Mask, which won the BARDA Mask Challenge, I believe in 2021. They did anthropomorphic scanning of a lot of children's faces, and they had the same data come back of the difference of nose bridge. And they designed two mask sizes across adult and children's that addressed shallower nose bridges so that fit was better. So I think we're starting to see more of a discussion of this. If you wear something that's comfortable, the likelihood that you're going to wear it for a longer time is increased.
Thanks so much, Victoria. Other members of our panel, thoughts on how standards can help with design strategies to decrease the confusion between folks using PPE in different settings?
It kind of goes hand in hand. Oh, sorry about that.
Go ahead.
I think it kind of goes hand in hand with kind of global harmonization of standards. If we're all speaking the same language on performance requirements, on design requirements, if they're kind of minimum viable design features you want to have included in products, I think that goes a long way in just making it easy for the users to understand, right? Knowing that there's different levels of background knowledge on a lot of these topics. Pre-COVID-19, I can guarantee you no one in the general public was thinking about filtration efficiency or source control for droplet transmission. Post-COVID, it's on everyone's mind right now. So I think just that education piece, as well as just a consistent message and a consistent set of performance requirements, will go a long way.
I think it's also important to understand in standards the dangers we face. So for example, the standards for a pandemic might be different than regular occupational settings and dangers. So we might be interested in using things like bacteria filtration efficiency ratings to understand how the masks are effective against preventing viruses. But also it's important to put in standards, for example, if you're using disposable PPE more than once, you stand a chance of the straps breaking, they become brittle. Also, people that were disinfecting N95s, it could damage the material, it could damage, it could also harm the user. So if people are looking for extended use of PPE, they should be directed towards PPE that is made for extended use, such as elastomeric respirators. But if people are just looking for PPE that you're going to wear for an hour at a time and then dispose of it, then disposable PPE such as N95s or surgical masks might be more effective for those individuals. So I think for different uses, we need to clarify, because some people are using the same N95 for weeks at a time, or they're using it for 40 hours worth of use, and they don't necessarily know when that strap is not going to be less effective and it's not sealing, because the disposable PPE was designed for single use only, and it wasn't designed for the way we're using it currently during the pandemic.
I'd add on the design process, I work mostly in the sports industry, and one of the tools that we use is called wear testing, and having this continuous feedback where you're receiving actual information from the user on the product and how it's performing and fit. And in some of the work that I do in PPE, I find that there's often a gap between the communication of the user to the manufacturer of all those challenges. And perhaps there's an opportunity through these standardization organizations to better document these challenges, so that there's almost a database of knowledge, so that folks aren't repeating these same mistakes over and over again.
We've also seen with the removal of public mask use, either by mandate or just public encouragement of people masking, that we've lost collective protections. We don't have broad IAQ standards yet. Those are being worked on, but we don't have any sort of broad IAQ protection. We don't have broad public transmission protection. And the longer a virus of any kind circulates, the fitness of it increases. So the more variants we see being produced by COVID, the XBB in particular, we see an increased binding capability of the ACE2 receptor, which means that our eyes are more vulnerable as a transmission pathway. And we spend a lot of time on the mask discussion for a lot of reasons. And you can wear an excellent quality mask your entire time in your exposed environment, but if you're not protecting your eyes, you have a very strong possibility of transmission through that pathway. So it really comes down to layering of protections, because there are some people that do not fit test for an N95 at all. It doesn't matter what brand. During the OSMS movement, we saw people moving to creating open source PAPRs for hospitals, because there were many healthcare workers that were never fit tested, and they tried to have PAPR as an extra protective pathway. So I think having performance standards across a wide variety of PPE that is accessible from the commercial market, but also from a design standpoint. So if people do not have access immediately, they can go to a small manufacturer who could make that one design for them. And this is very true for the disabled community. There's amazing innovators around PPE for the disabled community that don't have a development market for their innovations.
I would like to echo the excellent comments that Victoria and others made. I think that there is always going to be that niche application and that niche problem. And we need to forthrightly deal with that. But we can also take what we learn from that niche area and apply it more broadly, right? So everything that we learn makes it better for everyone. But it's something that is never going to go away.
I wanted to just add to the many excellent comments that have been made that in addition to performance standards as an important aspect of helping everybody understand which PPE to use and which applications, it is also important, we've seen, especially in the case of respiratory protection, to have a broader approval program in place, not just performance standards to meet, but also a comprehensive approval program that in the case of NIOSH's approval program for respirators includes the requirements of a quality control program to ensure that manufacturers continue to have the same level of high quality and performance throughout the lifetime of a product in a market, and also some post-market testing of the products to ensure that they continue to meet the standards. That's been a really important differentiator between N95 and some of the other filtering face piece respirator standards that are out there in the world.
I also want to add, it's important to know in standards when to wear the PPE and how to use it, because, for example, the risk between droplet transmission and airborne transmission is significantly different. The risk to an individual around somebody who's infectious and only by droplets spread, the danger is within 6 feet, and then you put the mask on before you get into that area. But with airborne transmission, you could be infected without an individual being in the same room. So the risk is greater over a greater area, and it's also a different risk, because if you step into an elevator, for example, and somebody that left the elevator prior to you entering was infectious, the virus particles could be suspended in the air. So you could still be infected and not even know if somebody was in the elevator before you. And even, for example, when you're entering a hospital or entrances of buildings where people often put masks, there's not very good ventilation in those areas. So with airborne transmission, when you're putting on or taking off a mask, you could be breathing in those virus particles. But if it was for just a droplet transmission, that wouldn't be as dangerous because you wouldn't have the individuals near you.
Thanks all. Let's go to another question, but loved the interplay between everybody on that one. So I think, Jennifer mentioned earlier this issue of how important collaboration is, and that there are some stakeholders, and I guess the question brought it up to some stakeholders that are underrepresented or left out of the conversation for design. So, I'd like to actually, given that we've got this really great breadth of perspectives on this panel, I'd like to ask our group more broadly, what other perspectives should be involved in the design standards that maybe are missing, or that, that are underrepresented at this point? And, do we have thoughts about how to reach those? Maybe Jennifer, if you don't mind, I'll go back to you first, because, we've sort of called out a specific example from you, and then I'd love to hear from other folks who else should be part of this.
So, there are subject matter experts and there are user groups out there. There are groups that represent different types of disabilities. And one of the things that I want to make clear in my comments is, I'm sure we all understand there's lots of different flavors of disability. And while I'm here representing that part of the conversation, I don't consider myself an expert in disability. I happen to be a CIH that is disabled, but I'm probably more a CIH first. But I want to caution against just going to the known groups, because in some ways that represents the people that have become engaged and involved, but it may not get the true locus of who's out there. So you really have to look at users and test things in the field. If I've learned anything over my 30-year career, I want to throw things on people and have them tell me what they think, and really see it operate. And I think that part is just as important as making sure we've got the right people at the table. Giving the people at the table and others a chance to test drive is really clearly a need with all of this.
We saw that in OSMS. We have a Facebook group that at the height of the pandemic, I think was about 70,000 people. It's around 67,000 now, which is pretty good considering how far out we are and we still have that many members. We were very fortunate to have an enormous amount of expertise and engagement from a large variety of stakeholders. It wasn't just new users come into our Facebook group. And I encourage anyone to join our Facebook group and go back to the beginning of the discussions, March 12th, 2020, and you will see amazing discussion threads talking about things that we've already brought up here around assistive technology, around filtration standards. From the very beginning, OSMS encouraged the promotion of standards, and our supply categories were created around whatever standards existed for whatever PPE people were making to help guide people's choices, and also if they wanted to make something, what to think about. So I think, once again, because we have so little collective action, and we are pushing more of the responsibility for protection onto the individual, there needs to be a focus on if I make something for myself and it fits this standard, if I vacuum form a shell of a mask and it passes these steps to get to this standard, it is okay for me to wear that because it meets that performance. And I think in terms of other than the end user being involved in that design process, I really think we need to look at additive technologies, because the distributed manufacturing additive technology community has the ability to create in small batches. So a manufacturer of 100,000 masks a day, they may not make this one thing that a niche community needs, but they can go to a small or retooled manufacturer and they could say, could you make me 12 of these for my class? But they want to know that what they're making is to a standard and it is safe. I think there's an additive technology, a gap filling here that can really help protect these communities, but the design itself needs to be able to reach a validation instead of the manufacturer reach the validation. This is a huge gap we think the design being elevated to validation could really solve.
All right, do we have one last thought from anybody else on our panel who hasn't commented on this particular question on, in addition to the end users' perspectives, another piece that's missing in this design standard conversation?
I think, speaking with the international community, some countries, for example, do have mask standards for children. So, for example, if we were looking to design a new standard for children, we could be reaching out to the countries that have already made these standards and ask how they did it, the stakeholders that were involved, and then we could repeat something similar and add to that as well and make it closer to what Americans need versus what those countries need, so that it passes individual American standards.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. I think that's a great point. Relying on the existing expertise that we have around the world is so important. Thank you again so much to our whole panel for the remarks, to the public for the great questions. And I am going to now pass it over to Michelle Feinberg. She's going to be moderating the next session on standards and manufacturing capacity. Thank you all so much.